SaaStock is the preeminent global community of SaaS founders. Thousands of companies are involved with this organization, and I had to join. I've enjoyed it for many, many years, going to the conferences and other venues, and I'm glad they've built an online community.
Welcome to the SaaS Revolution Show. Shelley Perry, Managing Director of Scalelogix Ventures. Welcome, Shelly.
I'm happy to be here, Alex. Always fun to chat with you about one of my favorite topics.
Yeah, well, great to have you back on the podcast. I think it was this time last year that we had you on. Also, because we had the upcoming Blueprint for CEOs SaaStock conference, which was happening in December 2020. That event last year was to help CEOs that were in that kind of 1 to 10 million journey. We had a great time recording the podcast and doing the mistakes that the first time founders make on that journey. And then the upcoming Blueprint for CEOs, which is happening on December the 7th this year. It's for the CEOs that have passed 10 million in ARR, but now they're on this journey. They want to scale to 100 million ARR. Now, this is really your sweet spot, the stuff that the bread and butter. And I just kind of thought, you're speaking at that event as well, along with, I think we've got the likes of Henry Schuck, CEO of ZoomInfo, Edith Harbour, who's the CEO of Launch Darkly, Girish Mathrubootham, CEO of Freshworks, Krish Subramanian from ChargeBee. So some great names there. Johnny Bufahat, the CEO of Hopin. So super excited about this event. What we thought would be a good idea, because we really enjoyed having you on the podcast last time, was trying to get a bit of that magic back and talking about this particular journey in this stage, all stages, and the top mistakes CEOs make when scaling from 10 million to 100 million ARR. So I'm excited to do this. Mainly listen to you because I don't have this knowledge, and but I mainly listen to you. And but yeah, I'm happy to go into it.
Yeah, let's get started. And as always, I think these things are better conversations. And I know it's a stage that you yourself are embarking on soon. So hopefully this can also be an extension of the session that we had last year, which I thought was
exactly.
great.
It was kind of good therapy for me last year as a first-time founder. And now I'll be we are recording, so but I'll take some mental notes and then physical notes sort of afterwards. So let's jump into it, Sherry, right? Shelley, even not Sherry. let's jump into it. Yeah. And let's talk about some of these mistakes. But I guess kind of first, if you want to set maybe this context about you seeing 10 to 100 as not one stage, yes. It's multiple stages.
Yeah, I think that it's important when we're talking about scale up, which of course is my absolute favorite kind of period of a company's growth for lots of reasons. But it is not 10 to 100 million is actually multiple stages of scale up. Some people break it down into 7 stages. Some people break it down into 5. Today, what I want to do is just break it into 2 or 3. We did the 0 to 10 in the last session. In this one, let's break it from 10 to 50 and 50 to 100. Because the first mistake that CEOs make, whether they're a founder who's kind of growing with the company or a takeover CEO for the first time in scale up, is they read advice or best practices, or they get advice from people, and they don't realize that that advice is perhaps for a different stage of growth in that scale up phase, or a different profile. Mistakes that founders who become CEOs of these scale up companies are going to make different mistakes than someone who has grown up in corporate America or in corporate business, kind of taking their first CEO role versus a GM type of role. And then also understanding what is their growth rate, because advice that you would give to someone, a company, a CEO running a company that is at a hyper growth rate, sustaining 100% year-on-year growth versus barely making the rule of 40 or edging up to rule of 50, the advice is going to be different. And I think the first mistake that CEOs make is not understanding kind of where am I, which advice should I filter out, which advice should I gravitate to, or how do I put that advice in context? how do you know what stage you're in? I wish that there was like a checklist that I could give you, but in fact, I'm sure I could if I spent much more time on it. But I think the best way to do it is try to find a trusted source, someone who is maybe not on your board or your investor, or someone who kind of has seen the gamut of different types of companies and can just try to help you kind of put where you are, not to pigeonhole you, but to help you kind of decipher through that information. So I think the best way to do it is try to understand that. And then as you're looking at content or getting advice at a conference, hopefully we'll be seeing people in person soon. But as you're getting that advice, you can kind of put it in context and then adjust it appropriately for where you are.
Would, I mean, you mentioned there that seeking maybe like an independent voice or person to help you understand where you are. Like, what about like on the board? Are they going to be biased to potentially to say like, here's where you are, or telling you something different?
I don't think that they're biased by any means. I think it could be that if they're on your board, they attract or they invest in a specific stage. And so, when you have a hammer, right, everything's a nail, or whatever that analogy is. And so sometimes it's not that they're being biased, it's just they don't have the exposure to kind of understand the different stages, because maybe they're an early investor and they've only seen a few, and it's hard for them to kind of understand the differences. So maybe they haven't been exposed to it. Or they're more advanced investors, because most people on your board, unless they're an independent, are investors. And so it's just more about what experience do they have to be able to see these patterns. There's one. And there's many investors that can do that because they have the experience kind of across the gamut, but there's also many that aren't. So I think it's not a bias, that it's just exposure to experience. And then operationally, the same thing. If you have an independent on your board who came from an operational side of software, or in the SaaS world or software world, they don't get exposed to kind of understanding that their advice is different. They're just giving you advice based on what they know, but they don't really have the pattern matching across different stages to be able to even recognize to tell you. So it's not necessarily biased. It's just more of lack of exposure to the patterns.
Gotcha. And then once you understand the stage that you are sort of truly at, then you'll get to know really what you need to do at that stage to get to the next one. Because if you believe that you're in a different stage, then you're going to be getting some of the wrong advice, right?
Well, you might be getting the wrong advice, but also sometimes it's you have to kind of manage the people on your board that might be telling you to do something in a different way. And you have to recognize that they typically specialize in, say, slow growth or hyper growth, or private equity. So you may have to use that information to kind of help educate someone who is, by every intention, giving you the best advice. But you have to kind of maybe inform them in a very nice way, in an influence way, that you're different to maybe something they might be giving you advice about. So I think it works both ways, but from how do you take that advice, but also how do you manage the advice you're given from your board or other trusted sources to try to change their lens as well.
Gotcha. Let's talk about the second mistake then. What would that be?
So the second mistake is, I'm going to call it kind of not understanding or not taking the time to define your expansion strategy. In the 0 to 10, we talk about finding product market fit, understanding where that product market fit is, that initial strategy, and just kind of narrowing in on it. As you move to that 10 to 50 million, your focus needs to be on, what's my expansion strategy going to be? And this just doesn't mean how am I going to sustain growth, because you might have a very long runway in your initial product that's going to help you sustain growth. That's not going to help you expand and sustain that growth long term. At some point, you're going to hit a wall with the growth rate of your existing product, and you have to be thinking about, how am I going to expand? And you have to think about it now, because it's not moves necessarily that you're going to make, right, in kind of that maybe 20 million year or 30 million year, but it's certainly going to affect kind of 40, 50 and onwards. And you have to decide, have it always a working kind of hypothesis of what that expansion strategy is going to be, so that you can say no to things, so that you can attract the right investors or go after the right investors, and also take on customers that would potentially want to go on that expansion strategy. If you're going to divest of a product range or do something different, you should also divest or work with those customers to kind of get them in a good place, because you always want to be customer centric. So in that expansion strategy, what happens is that there's two different mistakes that get made and by those kind of high growth, low growth, or CEOs that are founders versus CEOs that kind of come as a takeover. And the two areas, the two mistakes kind of go in two different directions. And the first one is that you don't start your second product early enough. You actually have to start it pretty early, because if you think back to how long it took you to achieve product market fit of your first product and how it took you to scale and kind of find that right fit, it doesn't take you quite as long in your second product, but it also doesn't happen overnight. So typically products take somewhere between 12 and 18 months to hit materiality. So think about, you're introducing a second product, but yet your first product is growing, so the base is getting higher, and yet you're introducing this new product. So for it to start to have materiality, you're chasing a total, and it takes kind of that 12 to 18 months time frame. Now that's just an average. Sometimes you can accelerate through that, sometimes it takes longer, but it doesn't happen overnight. So you need to start it early. And then also your second product, your organization does not have the muscle to launch a second product. You evolved your first product over time through whispering, through a lot of times the CEO is out there kind of like hawking the product. You got your VP of sales in there. You've got some repeatability, but you don't have the muscle in the organization to actually launch a second product, which ripples through the entire organization. So you also have to start training, and it's going to take you longer. It always takes you longer. After you do the second one, the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, they're going to be a lot easier. But that second one takes a long time, and you still are maintaining the momentum on your first product. So it's not starting your second product early enough. And that mistake is typically made by founders who are kind of going up, and investors who are used to investing in later stage, because they don't realize that the founder's not starting it, because they've not experienced investing in earlier stage where that doesn't happen. So, or they have worked with first-time CEOs that are scaling. So that typically happens in the kind of 10 to 50 with founders who are scaling for the first time. Now, the flip side of that is takeover CEOs who have come from companies that have lots of products. And what they want to do is the opposite of starting a second product. What they want to do is actually start many products at once, because they're used to kind of having this kind of, portfolio of products. So they just start developing lots of them. And that has a cascading effect. It's equally bad as not starting your second one, because starting too many is that you don't have enough resources to apply to them. And so you can't really start many of them. And often the same CEOs that want to start a lot of products are the same CEOs that tend to have a lower growth rate. Now, they might be able to sustain that same growth rate, 40, 50, 60% over a long period of time, because they have a lot of products. But if you have a early stage product that's hitting that 100%, you have to start your second product early enough so that you can continue to sustain that 100%. And those are kind of two conflicting mistakes that get made equally, but they are made usually by different profiles. And maybe it's not a mistake, right? If you're in it for the long haul and you have an investor that says it's okay to maintain 50% growth rate in perpetuity, then maybe you start multiple products. Each one of them is going to go slower. If your investors want you to maintain 100% growth rate because that's what you signed up for, and by the way, it's not the investors, it's what you as a founder or CEO that agreed to take the money, agreed to maintain that growth rate, then you have to be careful to not create too many products, and you have to create the ones that are going to kind of keep the focus and sustain that growth rate. So those are the mistakes that are typically made in the 10 to 50. And then in the 50 to 100, kind of what in that expansion strategy is understanding what is going to sustain the momentum much longer term. So in the 10 to 50, you really want to go like 1 to 2 products, but by the time you're hitting kind of closer to that 100, you should have the muscle memory in your organization to be able to launch 3, 4, 5, 6, to acquire, to cross-sell. So in that 10 to 50, you want to kind of get the ability to be able to expand into multiple products, or to at least a second product. But by the time you get to 50 to 100, you should be able to start sustaining 3, 4, and 5. But you have to get that second one first. And all of that is that expansion strategy. And that expansion strategy is, are you going to go sideways, adjacency, and kind of stay in the same target market, or are you going to move up to enterprise? Are you going to move down to PLG? Are you going to go from cheap and cheerful to the high touch, or whatever it is that you're going to do? You need to make those moves along that expansion strategy. And most CEOs in that kind of 10 to 50, they're just kind of like still flinging kind of some of the holes that they had to plug from the 0 to 10, and they aren't stepping back and creating that longer term expansion strategy early enough.
Yeah, a couple of things there. I mean, one, just on that 50 to 10, we'll hear from Johnny Buford, CEO of Hopin, at Blueprint for CEOs on the 7th. And I think what we saw similarly, they grew very rapidly to 50 million ARR, and then from 50 to 100, they've been very aggressive on the M&A side of things. I'm not sure how many companies they've bought, but I think it's in the realm of like 5, maybe 6 acquisitions to really kind of help them then really get to 100 million ARR. I think pretty quick, and I'm sure they're probably almost there. They were at 75 not too long ago, and on the trajectory they were on, I wouldn't bet against them being there or past that by December the 7th. So we'll hear from Johnny on that, which will be really fascinating. I think that would be a great conversation. I don't know, a stupid question, but it's something that kind of came to mind here. But have you ever seen, are there examples of SaaS companies getting to 100 million just on one product and not becoming multi-product companies? Or is it essential that you need to start thinking about it at some, and you have to have multiple products?
I've not really seen a company hit 100 million with a single product. Sometimes when we're standing at kind of a really far distance, we think it's a single product, but in the end, it could be a very similar product, but you are pricing and packaging it for, say, the enterprise versus mid, and you're allowing kind of different things, and you've had to invest in scaling. So I really have never seen myself, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. That means that I haven't seen them in terms of hitting that 100 million on a single product.
Gotcha. Makes sense. All right. What about the third mistake? What's the third mistake that CEOs make as they scale?
The third mistake is, I think we talked a little bit about this in the 0 to 10, but it carries through to the 10 to 50, 50 to 100, and that is not understanding how you, as the CEO, are spending your time. And I want to preface this that everything that I'm going to talk about is kind of an average, and it implies that you always kind of care about the customer, whatever your customer is. Again, cheap and cheerful or high touch, you always have customer in the center of your mind. So this is not excluding that. This is additive. So the way that I think about it in the highest level is in that 0 to 10, you're thinking about product. What's your product fit? How are you going to get it out there? Do people like it? You're listening, you're adjusting, and you're really, if you had to categorize the majority of your time, certainly not all of your time, but the majority of your time, kind of product focused. Even if you're the more salesy CEO or product CEO, almost everyone in the company, in a true SaaS company, is product focused. In kind of that 0 or 10 to 50, what you're focused on is expansion. And I don't just mean expansion in terms of the last topic we talked about. You're focusing on expanding yourself as a CEO. If you are coming from a founder moving up, you have skills that you need to learn and fill in as a CEO. If you are a first-time CEO of a scale-up company and you've been an executive in a larger company, you have things that you need to develop that you weren't exposed to in terms of that. So you are expanding your own kind of experience. You're expanding your C-suite. And in this case, especially in the 10 to 50, you're going to have a C-suite, which I define as anyone reporting to the CEO. You're going to have a C-suite that also needs to be developed. They've probably they're a mix, they have different experience, but they all kind of have a gap in the fact, just like you as a CEO or anyone as a CEO, you have a gap of kind of understanding the business impact end to end. You probably grew up as a functional leader and you're really good at your function, but you don't really understand kind of this business kind of end to end. And that's what most executives kind of need to learn at this stage. And who else is going to fill the gaps in? So not only as a CEO do you have to expand your own expertise, but you have to be expanding and coaching your C-suite, and in some cases kind of swapping them out, but they need to grow. And then you also need to be defining your expansion strategy as a company. So I kind of characterize the 10 to 50 as your time should be spent on expanding. And whatever that is, right? Your team, your portfolio, that's really kind of the bulk of where your time is spent on expanding. When you get to the 50 to 100, your time is spent on M&A activities, on market, kind of getting ready for, especially in the later stage of that 100 million, getting ready to be a public company or being acquired by a public company, because it's the natural extension of growth. So if 0 to 10 is product and kind of 10 to 50 is expansion, I would say 50 to 100 is outward, right? You're meeting people of you want to get more exposure to people, get exposure to you, to the M&A opportunities out there, to potentially getting acquired, to the public markets, to understanding different SaaS models. Whatever it is, you should be very much outwardly focused. And at that point, with all of the time that you spent on the product and the expansion strategy and developing your C-suite, you tend to, as a CEO, be much more outwardly focused. And if you don't do those things in the beginning, in up to getting to that 50, then you have to spend the time in the beginning of your 50 to 100 to get all of those things that may not have been done so that you can be outwardly focused. And what happens for a founder that's growing through that, I think it's hard for them to let it go. And they don't see like there's something that trips as you get, the checks get larger, kind of like just the stakes get higher, and they don't realize fast enough that they need to be more outwardly focused. And then the other side of it, if it's a takeover CEO coming from an enterprise, they don't realize, they just instantly go to outwardly focused. But if they're taking over a company where some of those fundamentals weren't put in place by the time they got to that 50, 60 million, they have to stop and realize that companies just don't get there, right? Because they came into an enterprise as an executive and those things were already in place. What they don't realize is they're not always in place. And if they instantly go to external focus because that's their MO, then there's going to be a lot of holes underneath and they're going to wait too long to realize it. So they got to kind of shore it up before they can go kind of very much externally facing.
Awesome. Well, I mean, a lot there to take in, but also, I think what we're doing here is, touching on a few things, for CEOs to be mindful of. And we're going to go much deeper into some of these things, certainly, expansion and leadership and metrics on December the 7th, that blueprint for CEOs. So super excited for that. But these are great, in terms of like 3 lessons that CEOs should certainly be thinking about, as they go on that journey. And then looking forward to going, even deeper and more like laser focused on particular points at Blueprint for CEOs. So we'll have 3 hours on December the 7th to go through that. We'll have 9 talks across the 3 themes of leadership, expansion and metrics with some of the great speakers that I mentioned earlier. So super excited to do that and dive into it. So yeah, Shelley, I mean, I really appreciate you sharing, some of your expert insights here today with the SaaStock audience. And for those that are listening that are over 10 million in revenue, please do go to SaaStock.com and look for Blueprint. Apply to attend the session with some of the best CEOs. And people in SaaS will be speaking at that event. So looking forward to that. So sign up today.
Yeah, it's a great lineup. I look forward to participating, and I encourage other CEOs to find your tribe. And I think this is a great place to do that. And try to find others that are kind of going through the same journey that you are in whatever growth rate and whatever stage you're in. I think this is a great place to meet other CEOs to create those connections.
Definitely. Well, Shelley, thanks so much. And you'll be in Europe during the time of Blueprint for CEOs.
Yes.
So it'll be exciting. Hopefully we'll see you in person whilst the conference itself will be virtual. Can't wait for that.
I'm looking forward to it. So, and also now that, as Americans, we're letting everyone else in, I'm happy that we have this reciprocity going. So hopefully we can get some more kind of face-to-face meetings, a little bit of energy going in 2022. So I look forward to it.
Definitely. Sounds good. Well, thanks so much, Shelley Perry, Managing Director at Scalelogix Ventures. Thanks for sharing with the SaaStock audience.
Thanks. Bye.